Good afternoon, everyone. I was, to be perfectly honest, expecting like 2 people today, and only because they were with me at the program yesterday and they promised to come. So seeing all of you here, I am partly gratified and partly nervous. So let's have an interesting discussion, and let's try to make it interactive. And if you have any questions in the middle, please raise your hand. You don't have to necessarily wait at the end. I love a good debate. I love a good argument. And so the topic today is the legacy trap. And so we have spent the last 2.5, 3 days talking about how large companies, and I'm assuming that most of us here in this room are from large companies, because startups don't have innovative officers. Startups are just innovative. They don't have innovation officers. So I'm assuming we're all from large companies, and I've spent my career, most of them in large companies, though I've also done a startup. And so we've sort of spent the last 3 days talking about how to become more nimble and agile and creative like startups. And clearly there's a lot of need and sense for that. But at the same time, there is some level of concern in terms of, can we truly become startups? Are we really clueless and difficult, or are there some structural challenges which address us? And so I'm trying to sort of address some of this. And I will base most of this on my experience somewhat at GE, mostly at ABB, and then the last year or so at Total. So a wide spectrum of large companies in different segments. And the title really comes, as you know, from when Lou Gerstner retired from IBM. He wrote his biography, and the title of his book was Teaching Elephants to Dance. Now, the other great person who wrote a book was Andy Grove, and as all you remember, his title of his book was Only the Paranoid Survive. And if you're part of Silicon Valley today, being paranoid is part of your DNA. You have to look over your shoulder and worry about the 3 guys or 3 girls and a dog sitting in a garage somewhere trying to disrupt you, make you obsolete. Just ask AOL, ask Lucent, ask Alta Vista, or any of these companies. So if you're Google, you're worried about Facebook. If you're Facebook, you're worried about Snapchat. If you are AWS, you're worried about edge computing. So it doesn't really matter. You may be dominant today, but you have to look over your shoulders. But for a long time, legacy companies which have been in business for the last 50, 100 years, have really not felt the pressure to be paranoid. And so when I was at ABB, we didn't feel that same pressure. And the answer was very simple. We sold motors, we sold transformers. And the principle of a motor hasn't changed in the last 100 years and isn't about to change in the next 100 years. Transformers haven't changed in the last 100 years. And the only thing they have become is bigger, smaller, faster, cheaper, whatever. But the core business has always remained. And so the question is, for a while we were comfortable in not being paranoid, but is that really something we can be comfortable about going forward? Now, this is a very interesting slide in terms of what is the environment we are facing today, okay? So on the left you see emerging technologies. And you can put your own favorite list of what's happening out there, but clearly there's a huge list of very, very interesting, disruptive stuff. And on the far right you have business models. So it's not just the emerging technologies that's driving change. So if you see automotive companies today, it's not just new technology, it's car sharing, it's all other kinds of applications and business models which are affecting it or impacting it. And then you have a whole range of factors which are compounding the effect of all of these. So, if we have seen technology move up and down in cycles all throughout history, but this seems to be the only time in history where change is happening in almost every single form of technology, be it on the chemistry side, physics side, be it in IT anyway. So there is a huge amount of change taking place in lots of technologies. It's also happening with a great amount of speed. It's also happening everywhere. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, you could say, okay, here are the 5 major universities, here are the major companies, and here is where change is coming from. Today, it's not just Germany and the US and France and Russia. It's China, it's India, it's Estonia, it's Kenya. I mean, some of the most interesting technology in terms of payments, etc., is coming out of Africa. So you really can't sit here and say, I just have to worry about these 4 institutions or these 3 universities. It's just happening everywhere. And the other interesting thing which is also happening is the convergence of IT and OT. With sensors and IoT and other things, it's no longer this is the domain of the information technology and this is the domain of operating technology. I know we have talked for 20 years about boardroom to the factory office and stuff like that, but it is actually happening now. Okay, and I will talk about the implications of it down the line. The other interesting thing that's also happening is convergence of B2B and B2C, right? And the one interesting thing we have noticed is, if you look historically, the development of technology basically started off at the government or military level, whether it's NASA or Department of Defense or Department of Energy or whatever. It then came down to industry, and then over time, it came down to the consumer. So you talk of transistors, you talk of calculators, you talk of computers, etc. Today, we are seeing almost the opposite. If you have new technology, you are far better off taking it first to the consumer market. We have seen stuff in robotics where rather than sell it to industry, they rather make games and toys out of that and sell it. Why? Speed to market is faster. The traction is faster. Branding is easier, right? And if somebody wanted to sell to technology versus, and the volume is much larger. Now look at, all of you have iPads or some form of tablet, right? Do you think your salespeople started using it before the consumer started using it? Do you think iPad came to ABB and Total and GE and said, hey, your salesman would like to use this? And then your salesman said, hey, by the way, maybe my kid may want to use it too. It was exactly the other way around. You were playing with it, you were watching movies on it, you were doing apps on it, and then suddenly somebody says, why can't I do this in my work? So it's actually the B2C and B2B is as well converging. And it's another thing why we have to be increasingly paranoid. And then I will talk a little bit later about the concept of asymmetric competitors. You're often competing with people who don't have exactly the same financial pressures as you have. And finally, as I touched on before, the emergence of China and India, not just in development and technology. I mean, China, there's just amazing stuff happening, the amount of money being spent on there, whether it's in AI or other things, we just can't ignore that. And the other interesting part is it applies not to just a company, whichever company you're in, it is also applying to your entire value chain. It's applying to your suppliers, it's happening to your customers, etc. So you just can't sit there and say, it's not happening to me, because you got to look around upward, downward, sideways, and say, so there is a significant amount. So, this slide can be somebody's dream, or this slide can be somebody's nightmare, depending upon which side you are on. So this is the standard view, if you will, of corporates and startups. This is kind of the caricature of startups and et cetera. And so all of us are slow, bureaucratic, whatever. And let's see if that's really the case. And so given that, we have clearly seen a range of industries which have been disrupted. Right? And we all have our favorite list of industries, but clearly the stuff which I think the earliest industries which got disrupted was where the impact of internet was felt the easiest, and typically in B2C industries. But you can also see that now happening across, and we can all have our set of industries, right? And the irony here is not just that the industries got disrupted, but that in many of these areas, you had either companies denying that this will ever happen. Okay, who will ever buy books on the internet? Who will ever want to watch a movie on a tablet? Who will ever want to do that? To the other end of the spectrum, which I don't know which is worse, is the technology which disrupted you was actually created by you. Right? I mean, Kodak actually was the inventor of digital photography. We all have heard stories about how Nokia had actually developed the earlier concept of similar to an iPhone, something with entertainment. And I have no doubt somebody who invented that took it to the boss and said, boss, we should do this. And the answer was, are you stupid? We're not in the entertainment business. We're in the telecom business, right? And so we have, if some of you may remember from your old days, the notion of the Kodak moment, if you have seen those ads, where it's the perfect family or friends, that's the Kodak moment where you sort of captured it on film, has now come to mean basically you just missed the opportunity. And that's the Kodak moment, when you wake up and realize that your entire market has just disappeared and somebody just grabbed it. And other people refer to it as also as the Nokia moment. And this is also a phrase I use very often internally, which unfortunately doesn't make me very popular. And when BU managers tell me that this will never happen to them, and my question is, then when do you think you will have your Nokia moment? So let's come back to the subject matter today, which is, what is a legacy trap, and why is that? Okay, there is a concept some of you may be familiar with, which is called path dependency. So, depending upon which path you take, other paths kind of close off to you. And so a good example of that is, we all know in order to improve lifestyle, reduce traffic, reduce carbon emissions, etc., that cities should be designed in a certain way, and you have to make them more bicycle friendly, etc., etc. And we've certainly seen a terrific example of that in Copenhagen and Amsterdam and other places. But other cities, being very old and have built the roads and buildings and houses, etc., are just trapped. There is not very much they can do in terms of installing all the things required for a brand new city or a city of the future, etc. Right? So a certain amount, just the fact that you have existed for so long, right? Whereas another very good example of avoiding the legacy trap, as we all know, is whether it's in Southeast Asia, where many countries just leapfrogged the landlines and went straight from having no telephones to directly into mobile phones. You're seeing that in Africa, where the internet is almost difficult to get, is very intermittent. So most internet transactions or payment transactions or whatever is done on the mobile phone. So they've kind of leapfrogged the internet. They've leapfrogged computers, etc. So based on my discussions with companies and my own experience, the first and the most difficult thing we have to accept is the fact that most of our senior management just doesn't get new technology. Okay? I think there is a tremendous digital divide. You just had to see, if some of you have seen, when Mark Zuckerberg got cross-examined by the senators in the US Senate. It was embarrassing. They had no clue what they were talking about. They had no clue what Facebook did, how technology worked, etc. Okay? And I remember even at ABB, where Total is different. It's in the oil and gas business. But even at ABB, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the notion of digital technology was difficult to sell. And you'd say, why? The answer very simply is the management was really made up of mechanical and electrical engineers. This was not something which came to them intuitively, right? And if these companies are struggling with it, I can imagine, right? So now we have a lot of you people are in large companies and you have executive committees or supervisory boards, etc. My assumption is most of them have chauffeur-driven cars. Is that a fair assumption? How many of your executive committee members do you think have ever taken Uber? How many of your executive committee members do you think have ever gone onto their LinkedIn profile if they have one? How many of them have ever spent time on Instagram or Facebook or even looked into Airbnb? And if they haven't, how the hell do they know what you're talking about? Right? So I often defined it or described it as, how do you explain a rainbow to a blind man? So there is a significant digital divide. And by the way, you can see that in many, many industries. Okay? And again, this is not to be critical, it's just a reality. And you just have to find a way around it. The other issue becomes uncertainty of adoption. You can agree on the fact that a certain technology will have impact, that a certain technology will be disruptive, but you don't really know how long it will take. So what do you do? Do you jump in and buy this? Do you spend a lot of money? Right? I mean, take PV. Today, solar is just taken for granted. It's at grid parity in many, many parts of the world. But how many people know that the first PV was actually invented in the 1950s in the Bell Labs? It's taken over 40, 50, 60 years to get to where it is today. Right? Back in the 90s and even 2000s, a lot of companies from BP to Total to Shell, etc., jumped in and bought large solar companies and bought large wind farm companies. And they had to very quickly write them off because they just jumped in too soon. So that's one of the challenges is you may agree that this is something which has to be kept an eye on. But what you don't know is, and take EVs also as a very good example. I mean, EVs have taken 10, 15 years to really come to the point they are today. And even today, you will find disagreement with a lot of people whether EVs will actually succeed or not. And by the way, if left to market mechanisms, EVs would not have succeeded as much was it not for regulatory pressure and rules and other things. So for example, in Amsterdam airport, no taxi can pick you up unless it's an EV, which is one of the pleasures of going to Amsterdam because you get picked up in a Tesla. The other example of this situation is Predix. I mean, Jeff Immelt at GE was right when he said the future is digital. He was right when he said a company like GE has to readjust and reposition itself. But the problem was he was too early. Spending billions of dollars in buying companies and spending billions of dollars in setting up when your customers are not fully ready yet. And so that's another of the reasons why the legacy companies are hesitant to jump in with both feet. The third issue is very clearly the required skills and market relationships. You may say, okay, this is the new sector, this is a new industry, this is a new platform. Do we really know anything about this? Do we really know how to sell this? Do we really know, do we have relationships there? I'll give you a good example. When I was running the venture group at ABB, we invested in a cybersecurity company. ABB does networks for factories, it does networks for utilities, and obviously anytime you have networks, you have to have cybersecurity as a major issue. And we sort of promised them a certain amount of volume of business, but we never saw that. And the answer simply was, in cybersecurity, you have to deal with the IT manager, not the factory manager. Our relationships over the last 20, 30 years were with the factory managers. They were with the plant managers. And they were not the ones making decisions about cybersecurity. And our compensation structure was more built around selling large projects, not $100,000 IT, cybersecurity. So those things are there. The other one is customer expectations of reliability. Fitbit can grow rapidly and then fall rapidly, and you can introduce a new iPhone or you can introduce a new whatever. But if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. Even as a consumer, if your iPhone or if your iWatch doesn't work properly, it's at worst, it's $200 gone or whatever. But you can't sell a transformer. There's no such thing as a minimum viable product when you're selling products to utilities or to factories, right? You can't say, hey, just take this transformer. If it doesn't work, we'll come back with the next one next week, right? So the whole concept of fail fast, fail often just doesn't work. You fail once and you're done. So again, the concept of reliability is very different. So when we start applying concepts of lean and agile and fail fast, etc., you got to think, say, look, guys, the business we are in, it doesn't really make sense. Our customers will not allow it. And finally, this is the one I was talking about, the asymmetric competitors, is because of convergence, you're now competing with everyone. Total is in direct distribution of energy, which leads us into behind the meter issues, which leads us to home automation and energy management, etc. And suddenly we are bumping up against Amazon, and we're bumping up against Ecobee, and we're bumping up against Apple, and we're bumping up against Google. So everybody's becoming everybody's competitor. Okay? But competing with Google is not easy. I mean, the amount of money they generate, very few companies generate, right? And I've seen a picture of Sergey Brin praying in a church, and he basically looks up and says, "God, let me know if you need anything." So that's one end of the spectrum, and then you have Amazon in the middle, who, as we all know, doesn't really believe in making profits. In fact, every time Amazon makes profits, its stock goes down. So if we turned around and said, this is our new business model, capital markets. We're going to move from making money to losing money because we're building market share. If any of your companies said that, what would happen to your stock? Just think about it, right? And then you're competing with startups for whom, forget profitability, revenue is not even an issue. They are out there, competing with you on all kinds of things. So these are asymmetric competitors who you're dealing with, and you really have to figure that out, all right? And finally, the most difficult thing is to let go of the current sources of revenue. You know change is coming, right? And I'll talk about this in the next chapter, which is, Total has 17,000 service stations around the world. Gas stations, we pump gas, okay? And we could argue and discuss and say, okay, with EVs and autonomous cars and car sharing, etc., the future of those gas stations is in question, the values are going to deteriorate, etc., etc., etc. So what do? There's a huge amount of cash coming from them today, right? So what do? The first I would recommend is we have to sort of step back and say, if things are truly changing, whether it's in the hotel industry or the movie industry or automotive or whatever, what is the future value chain going to look like? And where will money be made? Who will make it? In the automotive industry, is it going to be Uber? Is it going to be Waymo? Is it going to be Drivey? Is it going to be Getaround? Is it going to be... Who's going to make the money here? And how are you positioned there? The most natural instinct is to say, here are my skills and here are my assets, and I'm going to position myself thus on the new emerging value chain. The problem is that the best place to position yourself on the value chain? Or do you need to go and acquire new skills? You go back to the Total service stations. Where do we position ourselves on the new value chain? Now, we chose those locations for our service stations because of certain way traffic flows and people need to get on and off highways and fill up their cars and et cetera, et cetera. That's not going to be the same when you have electric cars. You may charge them at home, you may charge them at the office, you may charge them at McDonald's, there may be battery swapping coming up. What happens to those locations? We make money selling sandwiches and sodas and candies, etc. at the gas stations. If you have battery swapping, you come in, 2 minutes, you're gone, whatever, where are we going to make money? So where do we position ourselves on this value chain? And what skills do you need? The most dangerous thing is for the CEO to look at his buddy Joe and say, buddy Joe, you're now the chief digital officer. And Joe is very happy that Joe's gotten a promotion. The problem is the advantage of Joe being chief digital officer is Joe knows the company, but Joe doesn't know digital. But if you go outside and hire Bob from a young startup, he knows digital, but he doesn't know the company. And that's a big dilemma people have to face. And I know a number of speakers have addressed this. But I think a very good example is Walmart, where they acquired Jet.com, which was a competitor to Amazon. And then they made the CEO of Jet.com the chief digital officer for Walmart. So he was somebody who brought in a significant amount of credibility, experience, etc. And then going back to my earlier point about how do you give up your current cash flows, right? This is what I call the monkey theory. If you look at monkeys swinging from one branch to the other, the monkey never lets go of the first branch unless he is firmly secured on the second branch. Because if he knows if he doesn't do that, he's going to fall down and perhaps either kill himself, hurt himself, or fall prey to a predator. And so you have to have the monkey theory, right? We already spoke about predicts. They moved in too quickly. Some of you may remember back in the 90s, there was a Swedish bank, and unfortunately the name escapes me, decided that the future was internet. They actually physically closed down all their branches and said from now on, their customers will only do internet banking. Now, if you're creating a bank from scratch, that's one thing. But if you already have relationships and people on the ground, etc., that is suicidal, which they very quickly found out. Okay. And finally, the most important way you can address the future is through cooperating with and working with corporate venture groups. Creating your own corporate venture group and investing in these companies. Because at the end of the day, you know change is coming, but of the multiple technologies, you don't know which one will succeed. Of the multiple business models, you don't know which one will succeed. You don't know how long it will take. So what do? Do you just sit there and watch, or do you jump in? Or do you create optionality? You put in a few bucks, you watch it, you nurture it, you work with them, and if it doesn't work, all you have lost is your option money. And if it works, You're in there already, you got your foot in the door, you know what's happening, etc. So I would argue that this is a very, very powerful way. So I know the whole world of corporate venturing is very difficult. It's very easy if you're a financial investor to say, how do you define success? I put in $1, I want back 10. Whereas a corporate venture capitalist, it's not easy because you got to be both strategic and financial. And how you define success really is very tricky, and it changes every time your boss changes. Right? So, but the one thing you as a corporate venture capitalist should do and should think about is creating optionality. Right? So with that, we have just about 10 minutes left. So welcome questions, comments, disagreements, anything, what's on your mind?
I just linked to the last point, invest in and cooperate with startups through the venture capital. My question is how you can ensure that the learnings you get from the startups through the venture capital on the corporate level be communicated down to the business unit. I mean, you have different divisions and business units, and to see some gap or some miscommunication there.
Now you put your finger on one of the big pain points in corporate venture, which is, there's a saying in English, which is you can take the horse to the water, but you can't make it drink. You can invest in a lot of stuff, you can show your businesses, but you're absolutely right, it's not the easiest thing. And there are a range of reasons for that, from not invented here to you're too busy solving your, meeting your next quarter's numbers to whatever. Okay. So you can then say, okay, then the way to address it is that I shouldn't make an investment unless I really have the backing of a business unit. Okay. There is some merit to that, but the challenges with that are what I call the Christmas present problem, which is, if you've seen children when they get their Christmas gift, they're sort of very happy with it for the first 4 hours or 4 days, and then never look at it again. And so it's the same way in my experience, we have invested on behalf of business units who are very eager for it, but after a few days they lose interest because they got fires to put out. And you don't want to give a certain de facto veto to your business units onto where you want to invest, because if that's the only way you'll invest is if they say they'll support you or not, right? So the place where it works the best is when the business unit truly feels that it has a burning platform, or it feels that this is a technology which can truly disrupt it. Now, I didn't mention, again, atom power was a very interesting example from my ABB days where, we have switches in the world of electricity, and they're all mechanical switches. And we all know that at some point you'll get solid state switches. Okay. And so this was a company which came up with a solid state switch. But the problem was, ABB knew that was the future, but it did not know how long it would take for the market to adopt it, and what kind of liabilities would there be if it didn't succeed because it's a new product. So their approach was, let us invest in this company which has developed it. We will support it on R&D and go to market, etc. See how they proliferate and what the adoption rate is. And if, by the way, if it fails, it's Atom Power that failed, not ABB. And so from a liability and reputational and other perspective, it's not an issue. And then if it does succeed and if it does grow, then we have potentially the ability to buy it. Okay?
Hi. Standing up. Hi. Isn't there kind of, I think in my world there's two kind of problems. There's startup problems, like tagging your food. And then there's the big boys problems.
I'm sorry,
big boys problems,
big boy, yeah.
Like how to get rid of CO2 in shipping, how to fly a plane without CO2 or stuff like that. And if your growth strategy is actually through startups, you only solve the smaller problems and not the big boy problems.
Yeah. That's an interesting question. We do have a lot of startups working on methane capture and mitigation. There are a lot of startups working on carbon capture. It is, and you're absolutely right. And some of these are really social issues, and then now we sort of get into game theory kind of issues, and problem of the commons and stuff like that, right? And so, from a venture investing perspective, one of the first things we do is to say, is this a sector which is amenable to venture investing in terms of the amount of capital required and amount of time required, etc. Okay, and clearly some of these are not. Right? So the question becomes how do you resolve that? And one of the things actually the oil and gas industry has done is there's a group called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, which is the 12, 13 largest oil companies which have gotten together. And they've created a $1 billion fund called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Fund, whose primary purpose is to invest in methane and carbon capture, etc. And they all recognized that it's critical for society at large and oil companies to address this, but none of these are going to be able to be solved by any one of us on our own, either because they're too risky or too expensive, etc. And so therefore, let's all get together and do that. So that's one of the ways, at least the oil industry is trying to address that.
Hi, just kind of a follow-up to that point. We saw that in 2011, Total acquired this solar company, SunPower, which is a big one. I'm just trying to understand what determines what comes to your team, which is, I believe, is smaller in nature, and what determines more strategic acquisitions. Is it more game-changing things that you do through corporate M&A versus, maybe the mandate, maybe you can explain the mandate of the team.
So M&A very simply is this a company or a business or a sector we want to enter into? And you're buying a company, you're buying it 100%, and therefore you have to make sure there is a return on capital appropriate to the risk you're taking. Do you understand the sector? Can you integrate it? Is it a new business? The traditional M&A questions. On the venture side, we are not doing M&A. We are making investments. We're doing minority investments. We barely go above 10 or 15% at a time. So from our perspective, so if you look at M&A as the business of today, and R&D as focusing on, what's happening in the next 5 years, we are looking at what's happening next 5 or 10 years, right? So what we do is highly risky, may not ever happen, and we're just trying to create optionality, as I said earlier. So it could be new technologies, it could be new business models, it could be any range of things. So, and we may also decide, so I'll give you 2 examples. One is we may invest in something and we learn about it and we say, you know what, it's really not us. This is not what we really want to do. We don't have the skills, so let's avoid this. And this happened to me at least on 2 different times where we've invested in a company and we said, yes, this is a sector we want, but the business went out and bought the competitor of the company I invested in, right? So it's a little embarrassing for me and explain to my co-investors, but at least from a company perspective, they learned the sector, they realized who the players were and decided that somebody else was better suited for them. So that's the way we approach it.
We have time for one more question.
Have you worked in the opposite way? So I can see the beauty of the corporate venturing and kind of being able to work outside the strategy in order for something to eventually be the strategy. Every now and then we come across things within the corporates which are valuable outside the strategy. Have you worked in spinning that out and owning a minority? Do you have any words around that?
That question comes up very often, and there was a book written years ago called, Da Vinci in your attic, or something like that. Rembrandt's in your attic, of all the IP that's sitting on your shelf and nobody is using, etc. Conceptually, that's a great idea. You have something, and let's spin it off, right? And there are companies who have done very well doing that. Okay. There are the following challenges to doing that. One is if you take an IP and you go to a VC and say, hey, we'd like to sell this to you. The first question is, if it's so good, why aren't you doing it yourself? So there is a little bit of a information asymmetry. It's the same sort of dynamic as when you buy a used car, right? You feel the other person knows more about it than you do, and therefore you're by definition suspicious of it. Okay, so that's one issue. The second one is the whole concept of internal entrepreneurs or intrapreneurs, where so Joe comes up with an idea and he wants to spin it off, and he wants you to, fund it and give him 20% of the company, and he'll raise funding, etc. The problem with that is most people actually want their corporate benefits and salaries and the ability to come back if it fails. But if it succeeds, they want to be the next Mark Zuckerberg. So they're unwilling to take the risks that go with startups, but they want all the upside that go with startups. If you tell Joe that, wait a minute, we'll give this to you, we'll give you 15% of the company and you go, but if you fail, that's your problem, and we're not promising you anything when you come back. And by the way, you got to take the salary of a entrepreneur. You're not going to get the same benefits you did as a mid-level manager at whatever company you're in. 99% of the people will not sign up for that. So conceptually, you're right. We have struggled with how best to make it work, and if you can find the right entrepreneurs and people who are willing to spin off and take the risk, etc., then no reason why it couldn't work.
We've done it on a case of N=1 that was highly successful, but I'd be interested in hearing sort of anyone else who's done it and any experience from it.
Yeah, and if you have done it successfully and you can sort of generalize the principles behind it, I think our folks at Innovation Roundtable would love to have you present it at the next session. I think it would be a great topic. All right. Thank you, everyone. And if anybody has any other questions, comments, I'm happy to continue the discussion. Okay.